So I just finished editing this episode, and I want to start off by saying that this is just an incredible story that you're about to hear. But I also wanted to say that normal is not how I would describe this episode. There were a lot of things during the recording that just went south. Footage was corrupted. My mic stand literally just collapsed off my desk while we were recording. There were just a lot of odd things that happened. And as I was editing, I actually had a moment of conviction where I'm kind of glad everything went the way that it did, because I found myself getting very caught up in the production of what you're about to watch. And I actually had to take a step back and reevaluate how this video was going to play out. So instead of it being a high production value, there's actually going to be minimal editing. It's very uncut, very raw, and I think that it's fitting to be that way because the story that you're about to hear is very real, very human, and it's messy. That's just real life. So now that it's all said and done, I'm kind of glad everything that happened, and I'm excited for you to be brought into a very sacred conversation. So I hope you enjoy.
It's a weird way to start in the sense of like not the podcast, but just recollecting. So it was I mean, I'll obviously remember exact everything about it. So it was like Sunday, July 24th, 2022. Um, we like had gone to church in the morning, and then in the afternoon, into the late evening, my wife and I were just hanging out. We had some ice cream. We were gonna watch a movie. She's a couple months pregnant, and I just like cleared my throat just like that, and I felt something in my mouth, and I was like, "What the heck?" And so like I kind of just like touched it, see what it was, and it was just a bunch of blood on my hand, and I was like, "What the hell is going on?" And so I ran to the bathroom and I coughed, and just like a ton of blood just dumped into the sink. And I was like, Hazen, you got to call 911. And I grabbed the bucket. We had like a little trash can in our bathroom. And so like I grabbed that little bucket and then just kept coughing up blood. And they didn't know. So one of the weird things about our city is there's a ton of junkies and they like clog up all the ambulatory services. And so they're like, yeah, we don't know when we're going to be able to send an ambulance. So my wife was like, okay, boom, we're in the car and I'm coughing up blood in the front seat. She's driving us. She's like ripping through traffic like a getaway driver. And we go in and obviously like we go into a merge. I get ripped through super quick because dude coughing up blood is like priority numero uno. And so they like, I get IV stuff in me. They like start doing some tests. And it kind of like comes and goes. It slows down a bit. And then initially we're like, okay, what are like the main culprits of what's going on? So like I either have brutal lung cancer and I'm toast. And one of the nurses, emerge nurses, like, hey, yeah, they're testing for cancer and a few other things. You should know back ASAP. And we just don't hear anything for ages. Um, and it was like I go in at 7:30 at night. I'm walking around the hospital getting scans and I'm carrying my little blood bucket and they're like, "Do you want to change that?" And I was like, "Whatever." So like I have this like garbage pail and it's like, dude, like half a liter of blood in there. And so um really long that initial night, I don't get seen really. It's not that they forgot about me, but I just like they wanted to wait for like a respirologist, like a pulmonologist to come in. And so the morning after, my now doc, Dr. Rolf, he's the best. The dude probably saved my life more times than I can count. He was like livid. He was pretty pissed off. They're like, "Hey, you should have been admitted. You should have had this. You should have had that. We're gonna take care of you," kind of thing. So I get admitted to the ICU. They tell me it's not cancer, and then they're gonna do a couple procedures just to see like what's going on. So that initial time I go in, I'm in ICU. I get a bronchoscopy. They shove some tubes down your throat and they just like use a camera and they see what's going on. And then they had to like intubate me and put me on a ventilator, which I mean, like it was kind of life or death because they're like, if you start bleeding while you're down there, you're gonna drown on your own blood. And if we have to do a surgery, then whatever. So I come back to, and they're like, yeah, some arteries in your lung have popped, they burst. We don't know why. And what we're gonna do is set up a procedure where it's like a CT angiogram. What they do is they go into your femoral artery, so your groin, the big vein near your or artery near your groin. They like take their camera and laser gun and like go all the way up through your body into your lungs. And they just wanted to like get a map of everything. And so turns out there's a ton of inflammation in my lungs. They didn't know what was causing it. And I had all these extra arteries. And so like I used to be a runner and um I used to do really well. Like I would run marathons and I raced when I was in uni and stuff. And I did great and I played a ton of sports. And my doc was like, yeah, I mean, you have tons of extra arteries in your lungs. You're just oversupplying your body with oxygen. So you probably just never get tired. So they do that, and it ends up being the long weekend in July. And so I'm just in the hospital, and like I just have all these other episodes. So that first episode, I coughed up like a total of like 800 mils of blood, and like they froze some of the arteries, but eventually they popped again. And so I was in the hospital that first go for like 3 weeks, and I had a total of like three or four pretty big procedures in through the femoral artery. They go, and after they did the mapping, what they do is they like laser beam all the broken, like pretend they're just trees, like branches, artery branches. They like dam them off. And then they just want to monitor me to see if I stop bleeding. And I did for a bit, and then a few days later I'd bleed. So I was in there, which was, dude, I mean, I could go into so much detail, but it was I don't even know how to describe it. It was like hell on earth in one sense. My wife's 3 or 4 months pregnant. My family, my dad and my mom flew out. And there's a lot of times that were just like pretty touch and go. There's a few days I was MPO. You can't eat just in case I was going to bleed and they had to do another procedure. And so I lost a ton of weight. And I was just so weak and so tired. I'd lost like 2 liters of blood. And yeah, like there's one time Aislinn, I was just like literally too weak to wash myself. So Aislinn's like washing me in our little bathroom that I have. She's super pregnant, and I'm like this emaciated shell of myself. We're just like crying in there. I'm not a big crier, but we're just like kind of crying in there. Just being like, hey Lord, what is going on? Um, and there, like we got some answers as it was going along. And so then I just like stopped bleeding and we thought it was done, right? So like I get let out of the hospital sometime early August of that year, and I'm aces for like 3 months. We did a bunch of traveling. We were in Vancouver. I did like a separate trip on my own to Vancouver. I live in Canada, West Coast in BC. And then in November, I just like started coughing up blood again. We went out for sushi. Like my doctor was like, when you hit the 3 month mark, like you should be fine. Because like if you don't bleed for 3 months, so literally 3 months to the day, I like wake up, or we Aislinn's super pregnant, and I coughed up a little bit of blood, like the tiniest little speck. And my doctor's like, if you cough up anything, just come and we want to check you out. So I get the CT scan, and they're like, yeah, you're totally fine. So we would go buy some like celebratory sushi. We got like this enormous sushi platter and we put on a movie. We get home and I was feeling pretty tired. So I fell asleep during the movie and then I just woke up halfway through and I was coughing up tons of blood again. And so we're like, damn, like, okay, we got to go in. And so I'm in the hospital another few days and I get all the procedures, the bronchoscopies, the in through the femoral artery, the laser beam it shut. And then so from November 2022, I was just bleeding like once a month. And so like leading up until Christmas and then Ransom gets born and January 7th, I would just bleed every few weeks. And so I'd be in the hospital for a few days. Aislinn's running back and forth. Like hospital food is like feels like a ticking a box on a checklist of what you need to do, but like it's definitely not gonna help you heal. And so like Aislinn's bringing me food. We have like there's a Catholic church in our area that was like hooking us up, and family was there. And so then like Ransom's born and I was good for that, which was amazing. Praise God. Like so I got to see the birth and I was good around those first few days, first few weeks, and then I'm bleeding again. And then in February it's a big bleed, and then early March and late March. And like then it's like every other week I'm coughing up blood. And they give me like these pills that like they help your body clot. But then there's a risk of like if the blood clots and inside your arteries, then like you can get a blood clot and it can be fatal. And so like I was getting all this like weird leg pain and arm pain, and like you just don't want to go wait and emerge for like 6 hours for them to ultrasound your leg. Um, and then like things started getting super weird. So around April or May, I was bleeding like every other week, significant bleeds. And when I would go in for like scans, they're like, Josh, your lungs are looking healthier and healthier and stronger and stronger. We just don't know why they keep popping. I mean, that's not the medical language they used, obviously. And so June and July roll around, and late June, I get another procedure. So this is like my sixth one at that point. Like, and this is like 6 times through the femoral artery, which is the worst feeling. Like, I don't want to really paint it, but like you got to get a needle down there to freeze it. And so like that is super not comfortable. I'm like, there's only two people who've touched me. I guess four, my parents when I was a little kid cleaning me up. But just me and my wife that go down there. And so like the needle in there is weird, but then they slice you open and you can feel like your hot blood pour over your groin and down your leg. And then they shove the stuff in there and you get put on fentanyl. Like that's how they keep you awake, but like numb to the pain. And so I get this procedure late June, and the doctor's like, Josh, like your lungs are looking greater. They're looking really good. This one's pretty promising. And he's not one of those guys that's like, he's not an optimist. He's not a pessimist. He's just like, um, if he's on the spectrum, he's learned how to communicate with human beings really well. But he's just like so factual, data driven. And so we're like super pumped. And then it's my birthday, July 13th. Everything's aces. July 15th, I have just this other huge bleed. I just start coughing up a ton of blood. And I look at Aislinn and I was like, hey, I'm hitting my limit. Like, I mean, it was a tough year. There's so many things that go into it. And I'm in the hospital and I just start getting every time I'm in the hospital, people are messaging me on Instagram and friends texting and calling and stuff. And one of the things that hit me this last time when I was in the hospital for this July 15th was like, okay, um, I felt it's really tough to put into words without me sounding like a bit arrogant. And it's not arrogance at all. It's like, okay, Lord, like I can bear this, right? This has been hard on us, but um, it's harder on my wife and my kid, but she's really strong too. And I keep getting these messages from people who are like, hey, I've gone through something similar. I'm praying for you. Or like, I have unanswered medical stuff. And people just like when you share a bit of your story online, people resonate and I would just get these like bricks of text, excuse me, with people sharing like all their deepest, darkest fears and questions. And I was like, you know what? I've always really cared about people going through these painful situations. But then when you're in it and experiencing it, you're like, okay, you know what? There are all these separate moments that no one really understands. Like you get the procedure, and then like a Tuesday morning rolls around and something tweaks, and your mind just spirals and your heart just spirals. You're like, hey, what is going on? And that first time I was in the hospital, Aislinn got this word. She was like praying and she felt like God was speaking to her, which was so there's this time when Jesus saying to Peter, like, Satan has tried to sift you like wheat, but I've prayed for you, and when it's done, like you return and strengthen your brothers. And then she texts me when I'm in the hospital that verse, and she then texts me like, this kind only comes out by prayer and fasting. And so we have this moment where we're like, you know what? The amount of things that have gone on since like 2020, and like, and I mean like the whole framework of society has shifted. And it doesn't matter what side of the line people land on any of the political and pharmacological, whatever stuff. Like there's clearly some sort of spiritual warfare going on where like people hate each other and health is wild and so diametrically opposed. And then these families, these people feel like torn up and confused and lost. And my heart just went out for me. Yeah, like I was like, hey, Lord, I want to stop bleeding. I want to be a good husband and a good dad. And if you let me live, like I promise that I'm gonna do those things as best I can. But then I was thinking about these people who like maybe aren't as fortunate as me in the sense of like I was brought up pretty well. I'm showing my little guy Batman the Animated Series right now, and I was brought up on that and watching it. I start realizing all these areas of where my vision of strength and internal fortitude comes from. And it's so weird to say as like a 36-year-old man that like the animated series shaped my view of masculinity, but it like profoundly did. And so I'm watching with Ransom and I'm getting these moments where I'm like, oh yeah, like, yeah, I get it, Batman. Um, and so my heart just starts going out for these people who are like, hey, they might not have a support network like I have. I mean, they don't necessarily have thousands of people praying for them. Um, and so my heart was just like, okay, you know what? If there's anything that this platform can be used for, forget me, forget my art. We could just pray together. We could just do something crazy and be like, we're gonna have a day of fasting and prayer, and I'm gonna be on it, but I want everyone to be on it. So I just like posted it in my stories and I was like, would you people be interested? And like 3,000 people said yeah, they'd be into it. And I was like, okay, so we have to do this. So I get out of the hospital and we do the day of fasting and prayer, and it's like Friday. It's a Friday. I think it's almost like it's really tough to navigate how this shapes up. Um, so it's on a Friday. I think it's probably like the week before all this other stuff starts happening. So we do this day of fasting and prayer, and we like every hour I'm just posting like who we're praying for, here's some prayers you can pray along, whatever. And if you get any answers, just DM me. And if any breakthrough, like whatever, I'm going to use charismatic language, any breakthrough, any response, any like inkling of stuff you're feeling. And A's and Ransom's born, and so he's like puttering around the house and being amazing. And so we're like praying when we can. Like we use icons in our in our prayer stuff. And so um we get to the end of the day and we've prayed for me and we prayed for people with like fertility issues and cancer and depression and chronic pain and all this stuff. And like DMs start coming in like tons of people. And I was like, okay, Lord, what what is going on? So I get a message from my doctor, and we had like a checkup. He wanted to check up on me like a week after that last bleed. And he was like, hey, I was going through your file and we found like a fungus in your lung. And everyone's got it. So everyone has this thing called aspergillus. It's everywhere. It's in plants, it's in dirt, like it's in dust, it's just everywhere. So everyone has it in their lung, but if they catch it and it's above a certain amount, it just triggers. It doesn't necessarily mean you have it. And so my doctor was like, hey, um, none of your other levels, you have all these other like physiological responses to an overgrowth of this mold. He's like, you don't have any of that, but like, hey, we found it. Let's put you on some antifungals. So he writes us a prescription and I go to cash it in. Because I'm self-employed, I don't have any benefits. And in Canada, it's a bit different than the States. There's certain meds that are, I mean, I pay for in taxes, but there's certain meds that are covered and some that aren't. This wouldn't have been covered, so it'd have been like 5 grand because this stuff is like, yeah, bro. They're like slinging the deeps. And so um this is where things start getting crazy. So Friday night. This is Friday, July 24th, 2023. I think it's a Friday. We're out for a walk. We're with the little guy, and we bump into one of Aislin's friends' parents, and we had hung out with them a few times. They're cool people. And they're like, "Hey Josh, we've been praying for you. How's things going?" And I was like, I bled 9 days ago. So a bit weird. But hey, they think they found this fungus in my lungs. And Aislinn, who's very prophetic, she gets this feeling like I need to say what it is. So she just said, yeah, they found aspergillus in his lungs. And the wife, so Aislinn's friend's mom, was like, I have a really good friend who had that for years, this kind of infection. Let me connect you with her. And I was like, whoa, okay. So I get her number, I shoot her a text, and we connect down the road. Saturday rolls around, we have the family over. So Aislinn's parents are here, sisters, and then one of my brothers-in-law. So we have a bunch of people over and we're food and drink. I made some ribs or something on the barbecue. And I'm chatting with my brother-in-law, and I knew he worked in some pharma stuff. And I started telling them, they're like, "Hey, how's it going with everything?" And I was like, "Pretty good, trying to figure out this antifungal stuff, but like I can't, I mean, I can afford it. I just want to spend 5 grand if it's like a shot in the dark. If it's a sure thing, I mean, I spend 5 grand to survive for sure." And he's like, "Oh, dude." So he's like, "This is what I work in. Here's like the loopholes." So he literally gave me a ton of loopholes. I still haven't paid for any of, like, I haven't had to pay for any of it. I paid like 100 or 200 bucks at a time. So I was like, "Hey, that's crazy." So Sunday rolls around, I wake up, and normally I'm not on my phone ever on Sundays. And then I open my phone, and our old pastor from Toronto, like when we moved 4 or 5 years ago from Toronto, he posts in his story this picture of a lake. And I was like, "Yo, yo, yo, I know that lake. That's the lake around, like, you're so close to where I live." He's like, "Yeah, dude, we're in the city right beside yours." I was like, "Are you preaching?" He's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Okay, we're coming." So we show up, and like he obviously didn't know that I was going to be there until that morning. And he's preaching from Joshua. So I'm like already starting to feel some stuff. And the entire sermon is about suffering. And could you go on a little bit longer if it was going to lead to helping others? And so like I'm in the back of the auditorium, just like, okay, Lord, like if you made me strong for a reason, like I can bear this burden. I'm like weeping. And then he's like old school, he's brought up, he's Australian, so he's like old school Pentecostal. And now he's a part of like some other church movement. So like he gets a bit like, "Hey, I'm preaching now." And when he starts doing the Joshua 1 verse 8 stuff, be strong and very courageous, he just starts saying Joshua all the time, like God speaking to, and which is my name. And so he's like, "Joshua, you can be strong." And he keeps just like, he's riffing. He's like, for him, speaking prophetically. And I'm just like, every single word is just like piercing me so deep. And so, like, it's the end of the sermon, and I'm just sitting there. I'm like, "Okay, Lord, like, if this is the path, if I have to say, like, this is the thorn in my flesh, or this is just the pathway into becoming a saint and to being a blessing to the church, like, fine, I can do it." And I look at Aislinn and I'm like, "Babe, if this is the way, like, you have to bear this burden too. Like, it's not just me." And Ransom sitting there, like, he's like 7 months old at this time. And he's like crawling around and bopping. And I'm like, "Hey, you too, buddy. Like, this is a big thing." So Sam comes up and we catch up, and he's like, "Josh, I've been praying for you." They, at the end of this, him and his wife, they lay hands on me and pray. And we go home, and the whole way home, like Ransom falls asleep in the back. Aislinn's pretty chill, and I'm just driving home. It's like through winding roads through the mountains. It's idyllic. You can see the lakes. We live in a really beautiful spot. Um, and I'm just praying and thinking to myself, like, "Okay, God, clearly that was a word for me. Be strong. Can you endure a little? Can you endure a little longer?" And in my mind, I'm like, "Hey, I can say that theoretically, but the pragmatics of it are I'm going to taste like the oily tin in my mouth when I cough up blood. I'm going to be shuffled around on gurneys in a under like the pallid fluorescent lights of a hospital, and they're going to cut me open, and I'm going to have like days of recovery where I'm not allowed to move my legs because you can pop they put like a like a little plug, like a drain plug in your femoral artery. And I was like, that's the harder part to say yes to, like the nuts and bolts of what is going on. So Monday rolls around, and normally how the month, like our weeks were shaping up was I start work, we have coffee all together as a family, and then I'd start work. A's would like clean up, do housewifey kinds of things, and then at the end of the day when I was done, I would take Ransom out for a couple hours and give her some time just to like catch up, unwind, get a moment to breathe. Because our kid is like Tarzan. Like, have you know Disney's Tarzan? He's like a wild boy, which I love. And so that Monday morning, I'm working, and Aislinn would normally take Ransom to the beach in the afternoon. She's like, I need to go right now. So she like packs up, she drives, and she normally used to go, she has her favorite spot. And as she's going, she just gets this feeling of like, no, turn right and go to there's a beach like down every road. Once you go down to the water, there's all these gorgeous beaches. Honestly, this place is stupid pretty. It has significant issues, but it's stupid pretty. And so she's there, and there's this lady who sees Ransom, and she's being super sweet. She's like, oh man, kids are precious. Kids are amazing. Um, what a gift. And so like she's slowly like inching closer and closer to Aislinn and Ransom as they're playing, and she's like shuffling her towel, and they start having a conversation. And the lady like uses Ransom and Aislinn as this like springboard to start telling her story of like she had fertility issues and she had a kid later in life, and it took her and her husband years to conceive. And once they did, when she was pregnant and past like the scary time, she found out that her husband was cheating on her. And so like their relationship ended, and now her daughter is estranged from her, and she's getting emotional, and and the lady's talking to Aislinn, and she's like, just like enjoy it while you have it. And Aislinn's like, okay, my wife is so intense. She like the best way of saying it is like she is like a prophetic kind of character in the sense of there's no middle ground. Like if you're her friend, you will laugh as hard as you've ever laughed. You'll cry as hard as you've ever cried. And there are no like there's no shooting the breeze. It's like, hey, Corey, how's your day, man? And then you're like, this be like, hey, no, tell me how your day really is, and we're gonna go into it. So Aizen's like, you're super honest with me. I'm gonna tell you a bit of my story. And so she shares a bit of the story. And the lady just looks at Aizen. She's like, I know. And Aizen's like, what? And she's like, God told me to come here this morning to tell you that um he's gonna heal your husband. And so they both start weeping. I mean, I get emotional now just thinking about it, obviously. And they just like chat and pray, and they're crying, and Ransom's just like crawling around in the sand because he's only 7 months and like having a blast and being cute. And so Aizen comes home and tells me, and I was like, yeah, like I know. Um, and then the one thing she said is like you have to walk it out. And so like we just like a month goes by, and it's like mid-August, and there's no bleeding. But then it's like the apocalypse here. So this is when like British Columbia like was ablaze, and our city is like was like the epicenter of it. And like when I say it was the apocalypse, it was friggin' like Blade Runner 2049, like orange sky, haze, smoke, and my chest is like it's so difficult to explain. Like I would go to sleep, and when I was legit bleeding, dude, I was like sleeping like 10, I used to sleep like 6 hours a night. I was sleeping like 10 hours a night and taking 2 hour naps every day. And then um I started taking those pills, and I just stopped. I just like started sleeping 7 hours a night and feeling like 100%. So the apocalypse comes, we get nervous. I'm like, listen, like if I can get through the apocalypse and not bleed, like that's pretty dang significant because this is just literally pollution and irritants. So we go to the coast, and that was a little miracle story in and of itself. There's just so many little things that go on. September rolls around, we're back here. October, November, we hit the 3 month mark, and we're visiting my family. They live in Ontario. And I'm like, guys, like I just don't know how to describe it. Like I'm feeling good, I'm feeling strong. December, January rolls around. My family's back in BC visiting. It's Ransom's first birthday. This is like 6 months with no bleeding for me. And then we're like, okay, like if we hit a year, that's wild. So I book an appointment. I get a an ultrasound late January, and or not an ultrasound, a CT scan. And this is like when all of the feelings and words and stuff of July comes into like fruition. We're like, when you scan it, and if it looks bad, then to like what were we listening to? So I get this scan, and there's one night it takes a couple weeks for them to like review it, and then they post it online. And so like there's one night in February I can't sleep, and I'm like, I know that stupid thing is gonna get posted tonight. I just had a feeling. I'm not a very feely guy. Like I'm a pretty stupid spiritual person when it comes to like premonitions and clairvoyance or the feelings people get. Like kind of like a Neanderthal, but I just get this feeling. And so I open my phone and I check the my page, and there's like, hey, yeah, you report CT scan. And I'm like looking at it. It's like 2 in the morning. It's like, if I check this and it's good, I'm not sleeping. If I check this and it's bad, I'm not sleeping. But I have to know. So I click it and I start reading, and like I do, the guys who do this stuff are like, there is one lane of person who's in there, and it's like you are smart enough that you're either going to be confused as being on a spectrum, or like you're just so matter of fact. So it's like number one, this, number two, this. And I'm like, this is my life you're talking about. It's like bullet points. And long story short, they're just like, hey, all the airspace disease that was in the lower left lung is gone. And I was like, dude, like I can't even describe that feeling. So it's like 2 in the morning. I go wake Aislinn up, and she's panicking because I never, if I ever woke her up, I was bleeding. And so I'm like, babe, it's done. Like the airspace disease is gone. Like there's no inflammation. All the crazy twisted arteries, like, are they gone? We have no clue. And so I booked some follow-up appointments with my family doc and my respirologist. And when I meet with my family doc, I'm like, hey, talk to me about all this. And I've told him this story. He knows everything. So I start telling him this. I'm like, hey, like those antifungals I took for a few months, would they have done this? And he looks at me, he's like, no. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, I worked in the UK. The UK, tons of people in England. I'm a part of this Facebook group that is for like people with this lung disease, aspergillosis or whatever it is. And he's like, there are people who are on this for the rest of their life and they don't feel better. There are people who are on this for years before they feel marginal stuff. And if you're telling me you felt better after taking it for a day or two, like literally the day I took it, I didn't need sleep anymore, which makes me feel like, okay, God, you healed me on the day of fasting and prayer, and I just have been walking out all this stuff. And so I was like, so what do you say? And he just looks at me. He's like, take your miracle. There's just no description. So then I go to the my respirologist, who's a guy who's like, listen, Josh, you're probably gonna have a lifelong relationship with the hospital. And very matter of fact. And I tell him the same story, and he looks at me. I tell him family doc was like, yeah, the antifungals wouldn't do this. He studied in the UK. This he's like pro. And he's like, yeah, what do you want me to say? Like, you're not bleeding now. It's a miracle. Like, you were bleeding, you're not bleeding, and all the stuff is gone. All the stuff it could be is just gone. It's not there. And so we leave and we're like, okay, Lord, we don't know what caused this. We have our inclinations. I think it was pretty spiritual. Um, and so now it's been like 14 months since I bled last. And yeah, dude, like you always know like life is a vapor, and then that you're like, I'm not gonna live forever, but as a dude we're like, I'm never gonna die. God, you're gonna return before they take me out kind of thing. Um but I had this moment about like this arrogance I had where like I've always just been so dependent on your grace for life, and I frittered it away. And now just like the clarity of life that goes on where like I mean, dude, it is so difficult to describe, but there are moments where like I felt like I could see the other side. I'm just like, so then I did all this crazy stuff. Like I did this crazy diet and I lost a ton of weight and I had all this stuff. Like I was like, what happened, dude, it was just crazy. Like I was so skinny, but I was starting to feel so strong. So I lost like 30 pounds. It was like 170, 180, had a bit more muscle. And then, but I didn't work out and I just literally didn't eat any sugar, like no fruit. I ate like hyper clean. And I felt this truth. Like there's so many like crazy things that God was like revealing to me where it's like the outer body's wasting away, but damn, just inwardly being renewed day by day. So this whole season for me was like just like incremental um revelations. I don't know how else to say it. I don't mean that in some charismatic sense. Just like these eye-opening, soul-opening epiphanies that were like, if you had healed me in an instant, I would have probably still been a jackass, which is like my vices are like alcohol, anger, and apathy. And that's like you mix those three together and jackass spills out. And that's mostly gone. Like I mean, I still have bad days, but just the clarity of life. And so now it's pretty wild. So I mean, there's tons more to the story, but that's like it in a nutshell. Um, yeah, damn, what a wild ride. And the one thing I will say is that like it feels really crazy to be on the receiving end of what I perceive to be a miracle. And the only language I know for it is a miracle. Um, and because one of the crazy things, dude, is like I want the doctors to tell me I'm healed. And I'm like, why do I trust the doctors over what I feel God has revealed to me? Like, why do I need facts and data? And like, I have all my philosophical and theological issues with modernism and naturalism and scientism. And then here I am being like, well, if I don't get data on the status of my lungs, God, like, how am I supposed to know you healed me? So all that to say, like, feels really weird. There's a bit of survivor guilt, because tons of people around me in the ICU died. People in my hospital rooms around me died, and I mean, we would pray with them and chat with them, and um, like they're there one day and gone the next, and the family's broken, and you're like, okay, you know, I thought that was going to be me, and I made sure like I wrote a will down on a napkin, signed it because we didn't have one, and then they had to do it, and I didn't. And so like it's just weird space, but I'm pumped. I'm so happy to be alive. I'm so happy to be with my wife and my kid, and we got another one on the way. So yeah.
No, that's incredible. That's incredible. Gives a lot of context. I don't know. There's that story about Augustine who had to change his views on the charismatic and the healings and things like that because he heard too many stories. It's
Totally.
it's hard to be cessationist when you interact with people who, it's how do you argue with it? How do you I don't know.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's like you listen, like people will land even in charismatic spaces, different stuff on the gift of healing. Um, but like it's really hard, like the amount of like mental gymnastics you have to do where like my wife is very prophetic and these other people, like I would have one of the Catholic priests, he's a Ukrainian Byzantine Catholic priest. I used to go there for divine liturgy pretty often. And he came and there's one time, dude, so the my buddy who got me this icon, he dropped it off one time and he sent me a Lady of Lourdes prayer. And there's people we can chat about that down the road, but I had this one night in February where I was bleeding a ton, and he drops his stuff off, and I'm saying this prayer, and I had gone through my journey of being comfortable of how to navigate praying through Mary to like asking Mary to pray for me to her son. Um, and I felt so overwhelmed spiritually at that moment to be like, hey, I have like a spiritual mom. I have my mom who's 4,000 kilometers away, but I felt that motherly tenderness in that moment. And then I get wheeled out for an x-ray, and half an hour later, a doctor comes and she sees this. She's like, "Are you a Christian?" I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "Me too. Your bleeding stopped." And I was like, sorry, what?" And so it's like the gymnastics you have to go through to be like, God isn't speaking to and through people. And you can like maybe say they don't have the gift of prophet, but you have to at least admit that the world is magic and that every single moment God is speaking. And if you just had ears to hear, this would be the norm. Not necessarily that your bleeding's going to stop, but you would just be, people are always like, God is just Aslan's on the move kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Selah.
yeah, exactly. 14 months since the last bleed,
Mhm.
and you've navigated this entire experience. Kind of where you're at right now, are you confident in saying that this is a past season of suffering, or is it something that you kind of carry with you in, I don't want to say you're waiting for the ball to drop or the next shoe to come,
Yeah.
but what does that look like? Do you speak it as like a past thing? You're moving on.
Yeah.
Where is that?
It's one of those things that like you kind of map out bit by bit. At first you're just like waiting for the ball to drop. I have like a bunch of damage done to my respiratory system because of it. It's just like collateral damage, fallout. And so like your body does start healing itself, but for me it was taking a lot of time, obviously, because there's some significant damage. So your lung tissue regenerates. I know so much stuff about the respiratory system now. Like your lung tissue regenerates like every 7 months or it starts doing like a full thing every year. And so it took me a little bit longer, obviously, because I had some extra damage go down. And so bit by bit, I was still coughing and clearing out infection and scar tissue and old blood. And that's always super scary. Like you just, the feeling that I now realize people, you know, the meme of like, oh man, Lord, forgive me for all the times I took breathing clearly for granted. Like clearing your throat and just like getting the junk out that everybody does. Like every time I did it, I was like, there could be blood. There will be blood. Daniel Day-Lewis, starring Josh and Nadeau. Daniel Day-Lewis playing me. Um, and so like eventually that fear subsided. And so what we ended up doing was there's like I saw that I'm distrustful of the medical field. I just recognized that they were going to be there to, if I bled, they could stop it. But in the interim, there's nothing that they could really do except monitor. And so my wife and I like looked in all these other alternative things. So I was on all these herbs and I was on all this special diet and all this special stuff. And so like the ability to say that I feel healed was like incremental. So I'd hit 3 months, I'd hit 6 months, I hit a year. And we'd have scares, like there were scares along the way where like I'd get a nosebleed and we didn't know, and I would cough and there'd be blood, and then I'd like blow my nose and I'd be like, okay, whoa, that was a close call. So I feel comfortable saying God healed me. Um, I also feel comfortable, like, if God forbid, and Lord, please no, it ever happened again, I don't think it would negate the fact that He did heal me, because I was bleeding every week and now it's been 14 months. So something special went on. And so the way I conceptualize it now is I am in a season of healing. And by God's grace, that season will be 50 years. And if I start coughing up blood at 85, I'd be like, listen, don't patch me up. Just like, I'm ready. If I make it to 85, dude, don't put me on life support. Don't make me be a drain on the system. Just let me go home. So I'm super comfortable to be like, yeah, God healed me. This is a season of healing and joy and jubilee, and we are owning it as much as we can.
You look at this season, I guess I'm curious, kind of what your relationship with it is. I know we can kind of get in this mindset of like we have to find like that secret meaning to it, or like that silver lining, if you will. And so I'm
Hmm.
curious if in your perspective, if you look at it and say that was just a really bad time, or do you
Hmm.
fully embrace it as, hey, I look at it with kind of a joyful perspective now that I'm on the other side of it?
Yeah. It's pretty tough to navigate. Like, one of the hidden graces of it, first off, I just don't know how people suffer if they're not believers. As in, like, being a recipient of God's grace, either directly from the source or through community. One of the crazy things, dude, is it doesn't even feel like I lived it. Like, I know I lived it. Like, I had to go back into the hospital the other day because I was playing with Ransom, and so I got this like little triggered feeling right around my vein. And I was like, oh, dude, am I getting like is this a blood clot? And I watched my vein like bubble up and then disappear and then swell again. And I was like, so I was like, whatever, I'm just gonna go in. He's asleep. Aizen will go to bed. And if it takes me all night, it's fine. Um, and so when I went back, there was initially times when I would go back and I would get triggered. And then I went back this time and I was like, I'm sitting in Emerge, the same stupid place where I had my bucket of blood. And I'm like playing chess on my phone, which is like super chill. And I was like, oh Lord, like what a grace. Like I don't remember on and in my body the pain and fear anymore. Um, so that time sucked. Like it was really hard. Um, but Aizen and I said the other day, like I wouldn't take it away because of the things that I've learned and how crystal clear my life is now. Like I think there is a severe mercy that accompanied it. Um, so I do feel spiritual warfare primarily, and I can share more about that some other time or down the road. Um, but the mercy is the way my life has been going leading up to that, and then since then is I truly do believe that it is like a bit of a mercy, the clarity with which I now view life on the cusp of things that genuinely, like, we both know we're in church world, like church land um is like pandemonium, and people are like chewed up and spit out by money and clout and sex and celebrity and fame and all that stuff. And I don't think I was going to go down that path, but I know that there would have been just like a slow creep. Like, so I'll tell you a story. Um, I got invited. This is before the bleeding, but I got invited to go to this like event. It was like young thought leaders. Hey, we love the stuff you're up to. We want to support you and encourage you, hear you, and then see how we can come alongside your ministry. And it's like a big wine and dine weekend. You show up someplace, it's like caviar and scotch of the finest blend and herbals to smoke, not illegal ones. I guess weed's legal everywhere, but like tobacco, so good cigars. And I get a message from someone who follows me, who's a famous pastor who can remain nameless. He's like, Josh, don't go. And I was like, oh, okay. And I look back on it now, and it seems like it's one of those places like, yeah, we will set you right, sign on the dotted line, and this is the stuff you say and don't say. And I don't think that was ever going to happen to me legit because I'm like old school punk rock. Like I'm against anything big, including myself. So like the bigger my page gets, I'm like, Leo, I could blow this up and start all over. Um, but I think that if things had gone that way, I wonder what the slow creep would have been like relationally with my wife. Or not that I would sleep around. That's not what I'm saying. I just mean like, hey, Ace and I have like ministry to do. Or like, hey, we're doing really well. Like instead of like a $30 bourbon to sip on, I mean, I haven't drank in over a year, but I drank a lot before that, a vice of mine. But instead of a $30, it turns into like $100. And then if things keep going well, it turns into a $300. And then eventually it's just slow creep where I become like cringy You know, like, I don't know if you've seen these podcasts, but it's these podcasts that just rip on comedians now who try to appeal to the everyman. Well, they rake in hundreds of $1 million a year and they'll be like, oh, yeah, we know exactly what it's like traveling by plane. Be like, bro, you have no clue what life is like. And so I had this moment where, so I think it was a severe mercy. I think God protected, I mean, I think he revealed a lot of things to me. And I think it was just a moment where it's like, Josh, all the things have been bubbling up inside of you, all of the calling you feel like you have, all the direction that matters more than you realize. And your life now, like, is mine. I saved it. I saved your soul and I told you it was mine. And you're like a young, arrogant guy who thought you could call the shots. And now I saved you. And so, like, it's mine. And any whiff of that, like, you hated it before, but maybe you would have thought, be like, oh, I can play with fire. And like Proverbs, like, which of you can play with fire in his chest and not get burned? God was like, listen, just like not even a hint. And so there's so many lessons that we've received and ways of viewing life. And like, honestly, dude, like, I don't say this lightly, and it took a very long time to learn, but um, we're pregnant with our second, and literally, like, the target date is 2 weeks after Ransom's birthday. And so it's really tricky to be like, hey, is this not like a Job echo? Like, you have repaid in full. You have redeemed beauty from ashes. And like, I used to be like, dude, like, how could you not just be like, yeah, thanks for the new kids, but I miss my old one, God. Like, like Job, like, how do you not say that? And now I'm like, hey, like, I just say thanks for the new life. I don't miss my old one. I really don't miss the person I used to be. I don't miss the outlook I used to have. And so it's this weird thing where I'd say, like, God, I never want to go through it again. But if I have to, if this is what comes out the other side, like, and listen, dude, like, I'm not perfect. I don't want to give this idea. Like, I was so bad off that it took like literally a near-death experience to get my head on straight enough to like be cogent. Um, but if this is what comes out the other side, I'm like, Lord, you are still in the business of healing people. And maybe, God forbid, next time it could be anything in my body, doesn't get healed. But if you do this work in my soul, aces. I say it now, I'll be scared as hell if anything happens to my family. But um, so it's a weird answer, I know, but that's because I think the people who tell you like, hey, yeah, like I look on it with joy, maybe God did something deeper in them. That year was hell, and I'm so thankful for everything I've learned, but I don't turn around and be like, yeah, bring on the next one. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have a book to sell that requires insane positivism. I have a book to sell that requires insane authenticity because that's where God meets you.
Your healing journey, from what I'm picking up, healing physically has been taking place, and that's been a mercy and a grace. But there's been a spiritual healing, if you will, that's been happening. And from what I'm picking up, and this could be true of all people, especially believers that God is sanctifying, would you agree that the most important healing that can take place is the healing of the soul? And so, what happens with the lungs is what happens with the lungs. But, you know, I'd rather enter eternity without lungs and
Yeah.
a better soul. So, um, I'm curious now. We we have differing backgrounds, but you come from a reformed background, no longer reformed, no longer claim that. I different. I've entered into that world as of late.
Hmm.
Um, but
No judgment.
yeah, no, it's okay. And it'd be okay if you did. So a lot of reformed people, and this is a flaw. We we take suffering and we make it a very neat thing, and we
Yeah.
package it to say, okay, this has happened to me because God decreed it, and because God is good, we're just going to trust that it's good. And then you have these atrocious things happening to people, and what they're given is God decreed it, just kind of trust the process and,
Mhm.
grit your teeth, which you would consider, correct me if this isn't the right term, but you'd consider that deterministic.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to hear you articulate from a non-reformed perspective
Yeah.
what what did happen to you.
Yeah. It's a great question. And it's one of those things where like um things get philosophical really quick. So I think from like a story, and I grew up like reformed, and so I would watch people go through these horrible things. And I would watch them just like repeat the line. And whether or not they believed it, they repeated the line because that's what they had to do to show some sort of external form of spiritual maturity. But they're like, there's people who are losing kids, and like now that makes sense to me. Like you have kids, I have kids. Like if something happened to ransom, I would be like, okay, Lord, why? There's you don't get up running, right? You don't hit the ground running. You don't get up for a while. And then to like slap on the idea of a determinism, and I know there are layers. There's like fatalism and determinism and so-called compatibilism. I have my issues. Um, that just adds another layer of complexity. And the difficulty that I had, so my journey out of reform stuff was philosophical and broadly theological. I was literally at a Reformed Baptist seminary, and I was writing a paper on the hypostatic union and the nature of Jesus. And I started reading Catholics, and I was like, because you just have to read scholars. You just read scholarship when you're doing your master's. And I was like, oh, yo, these guys are awesome. And then you're reading people who are like Old Testament scholars who are outside the Reformed camp, because not a lot of people are Reformed like in the scholarly world.
Yep.
This is no harm, no foul. Like it's just such a broad smattering. Not a lot
Mhm.
of people are Christians in the academic scholarly world. Um, and like they were just answering questions different from me. And so my journey out was like long and drawn out, but my view of things now is it's really difficult. I can say it like colloquially. Um, and if we had to define stuff, I would probably need a little bit more time in the sense of like, okay, I would want to say what I mean by free will
Mhm.
and what I mean by God allowed, because we don't mean the same thing, because we don't have the same presuppositions.
Mhm.
But I think what happened for my life was I think part of it was my fault, and I don't mind saying some of that. I think part of it was being brought up in a broken world. And so I had some congenital, like I just had some stuff going on in my lungs since birth. That's what my doc said. He's like, you've had it for a while or since birth. And then I did a couple things growing up that I had these severe allergic reactions to stuff, and I had really bad bronchitis pneumonia. So it's just like a whirlwind of garbage going on in the lungs. Um, I think what happened, like the way that I conceive of God's world is every evil thing that happens is of some sort of demonic source. So I don't think evil exists ontologically. I think it exists ad hoc when someone chooses to reject God. So I don't think evil is a thing. Like I don't think it has being. And so I think that when I say this is spiritual, I mean it like I've spent so much time reading the church fathers that when something bad goes on, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the devils, that's the demons.
Mhm.
Even if it's my own will, like there's like these voices that tell you, like, I mean, we all know, like, you know, that feeling you get when you're like pissed at your family for no reason, like even if they've done something wrong, there's like this rage building,
Yep.
and you have this like inside voice that's like, just do it.
Yep.
And then you let loose and you're like, okay, I'm an idiot. So I think for me, I would say when God allows things to happen, um, I don't, my framework of allowance is not like a Calvinistic framework of allowance, nor is it like this open theistic view of allowance.
Yep.
So I think in my life, God saw and knew and knows what is going on. And then I think that like humans have libertarian free will. And so I think in his mercy and grace, he was like, "Okay, Josh, like we're gonna get through this. I'm going to redeem this. You need to obey me and like follow, and everything's gonna be okay." Um, so like if I had to say it theologically, there's a lot more that goes into it, but where instead of saying it was decreed and predetermined, even if say like you're Molinistic or I'm not, but if you're something along those lines, there are ways to say that God, yeah, God knew it was going to happen. I don't necessarily think that foreknowledge entails determinism. I think that um whatever. We can get super deep. I don't agree with William Lane Craig on a bunch of stuff. Whatever. He kind of proved the whole like foreknowledge doesn't entail determinism or whatever. There are all these conditionals. All of that to say, if I had to wrap it around with like deep philosophical and theological language, I would say, yeah, like God did know, but there is a synergy where God is going to work and humans are going to work. And I see that pattern happen in Genesis, where God creates humanity to reign and rule with him. And part of that, it's not a removal of his sovereignty. He's still the king, but it is an entrusting of authority to people to actualize real change. God's will never be thwarted, but I don't think that he needs to override my free will in order to get there. So for me in my situation, I think there was this synergy and harmony where I was like, you know what, Lord, my back's up against the wall. Like, yeah, I'm gonna do whatever it takes. Um, and I think that the synergy, my will working with his will, is what led to the healing. That's not to say that, like, if I didn't obey, he wouldn't have healed me. Whatever he wanted to do and bring about would still happen. And so it gets tricky, right? Because there are like, I just want to like preempt. I don't know if you have a bunch of reform people who follow you, but I know the words where it's like, oh, like, could God's will ever be thwarted? And who are you, oh man, to like talk back to God and be like, no, 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 that's not my conception of this. I know what the catchphrases are, and they make sense internally, and they are coherent internally. I think they're based on bad presuppositions, but they do make sense. And just because humans play a role doesn't mean we deserve any glory. Like Paul says, like I run the race so as to win a prize. And then he like also in another passage is like, it wasn't me, it was like God working in me. Like I recognize the source of where all this goodness comes from. Um, and so I do see I'm a synergist. I think everyone but reform people are synergists, even like hardcore Thomists are. And there's nothing wrong with it. I think monergism has like really good intentions. And I'm not trying to be a pretentious, like condescending, patronizing, but um, that's me trying my best not to cuss as much as that's one of the things I'm working on. I think the intentions are like, yeah, we want to preserve God's glory, God's power, God's ability to work in the world and bring about the great good. And so I don't put it on the level of like the Pharisees creating all these other rules to preserve people. I think it is like a really good and true thing. Um, I just think free will is the thing you can't lose, or else a lot of other stuff doesn't make sense. And like I'm not one to I'm sorry for ranting, but to generally appeal to mystery. But that synergy, every church father who does talk about synergy, they give language, they talk about libertarianism, and like John of Damascus talks about this and how we cooperate with God and what that looks like in his dealings with the world. But eventually it just becomes a mystery. Like when you eventually down the line, doesn't matter where you land, there's this appeal to mystery we all make. If you're a monergist, it'd be like, well, God, how come you're not the source of evil if you decreed this? Appeal to mystery. It'd be like a synergist, hey, like if you have a liberty, like does your will dominate God's? No. Why?
Kill
Because
mystery. Yeah,
yeah.
I love it. So there is this, you know, explanation, or you have an understanding of what has happened. I feel like a lot of people get extremely weighed down, and I think this is probably the appeal of maybe the reformed view of suffering is purpose. People would hate to go through something so terrible and to be completely meaningless. And I think people who can
Yeah.
say it has happened and I've gone through it because God has allowed it, there's at least that level of, well, at least there's a purpose. And I may not know that purpose, but I know that God did this to me. So there's that level of purpose. So in your framework, kind of building
Mhm.
off of, what has happened, you can articulate what has happened in that framework. Where do you find purpose in suffering?
It's a great question. So when I was in the reform world, there was that you just got a really quick, easy answer, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. I could be wrong. Um, and so yeah, you could just derive a quick purpose, but I felt for myself that a lot of those quick and easy answers abdicated my responsibility to cultivate maturity, purpose, and to pay attention and listen. So if you like it for me, it was like putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound and be like, well, there's my take two platitudes, go call me in the morning, right? Um, and so I think purpose is always cultivated. Every situation requires cultivation and invitation and participation. So one of the things I learned reading all these Eastern Orthodox folk was say you become like an Eastern Orthodox catechumen, at least under this one dude I was reading. I can't remember his name, and he'd probably be very thankful because they're all very like, don't talk to me, let me pray. He was like, here's the two ways we conceptualize of God. Number one, God is a father. Number two, God is Trinity. God as Father is relational and source. God as Trinity is mystery and invitation. And so like if you would go through these things in under like an Eastern Orthodox framework, this guy's saying like in his parish, you'd spend the first couple years just reading the Psalms and Gospels. So you need to learn how to pray and express yourself, and then you need to know who Jesus is. And so say you go up to someone and you're like, hey, I'm suffering. What's going on? Like, why is this happening to me? The priest, the father would just be like, I don't know. Let's journey on it together. So you could get a philosophical or theological reason, and someone could say to you, like, Josh, this happened to you, so God will be glorified. Like, who sent this man or father or his father? Oh, so God will be glorified. There's your answer. Oh, I pleaded for the stone to be taken away from me. My grace is sufficient for you. Boom, there's your answer. But the invitation of suffering is to say, like, Lord, give me eyes to see, give me ears to hear, and please take away this like stubborn heart that wants to reject the path that you have for me. And so like my purpose, what I think God has brought about through this suffering is um all of my core values just they went they're super clarified. All the things that really matter to me, my wife and my son, my family, and then after that, whatever I'm doing with sword and pencil. I hesitate to call it ministry, but that's just like my own struggles. But whatever's going on there, those things all really matter to me in that order. Um, and the clarity that came with that of like, Josh, uh, God saying this to me, Josh, you are a tool in my hand, and I will use you to be a great husband to minister to your wife, a great father to minister to your children, a great son and brother to minister to your family, and then a great blah to minister to the virtual world on Instagram and beyond. And if if you participate, if you follow me and multiply the gifts I've given you. So like I've always had that view, but like it was like before looking through a glass dimly, and then someone like cleaned it a little bit. Like I beheld enough of God that I was like, okay, all of this is so much more clear. So now when stuff is going on, um, I don't, so I'll share something. So I get on all these calls for my book, and they talk about like, hey, people are going to want you to do the conference circuit. You can talk about book stuff and whatever else. And here's a suggested amount we think you should request getting paid. This is what people ask for. And I was like, no. First off, I'm not asking for that much money. And second off, what that looks like is it cuts out the people I care about. I don't really care to go to a mega church. I mean, I will, and I'll take their money, like not that amount because I have my rules. But what I really care about is like this church. It's like, listen, we can't afford to fly you out. We can't afford to pay you, but would you come? And I'd be like, yeah, of course. Like I really care about real people. And I was like, Lord, I wonder if I didn't have this go on, if I would be like, hey, those are people and they talk to other people and they talk to other people. But this core value that I grew up with because of my family of like, the people that really matter are like the ones who don't have Instagram, who don't have a platform, the local pastors, like, dude, to riff on something Spurgeon said, one of my favorite, like one of the greatest Reformed dudes ever. Reform, definitely the best Reformed Baptist, and I'd defend that to my dying breath. But he tells a story of like, hey, are you going to see the Wesley brothers in heaven? A question about their belief on providence and salvation. And he's like, no. And everyone's like, whoa, you know that like soy jack meme of like, oh, whatever. Everyone's like, and he's like, they'll be so close to the throne that like I just won't see them. And I have that feeling about every local church pastor who's got a parish and whatever of like 50 people. And he posts his like little boomer memes on Facebook. And he also makes the church bulletin, and he also sings, and he also preaches, and he also does visitation, and he's up praying. And I'm like, those are the dudes. And those are the families that are after it. And I think for me, so my family comes first. And when I think about ministry, I'm not after lights, I'm not after stage, I'm after like those real people. If I can help those real people and be like, listen, you're doing the real work, my life is cushy. I draw pictures and write. You are like saving, you are the guy who met me in the hospital, right? Like, so when the Catholic priest came, dude, this guy was a G. He's like, he doesn't speak English very well. He brings oil from Jerusalem. He anoints me with holy water. He anoints me with oil. He's walking down the hallway and he's stopping, praying for people in the hallways. He's splashing holy water in every room and he's blessing them and praying for them. And I'm like, this guy doesn't know me. Like, I just go to the divine liturgy every once in a while. And he's just so locked in. And I was like, this city doesn't know that the reason it hasn't descended into complete madness is because of people like him. And so I want to minister to the people who are doing the real deal stuff. Like this world is like rises and falls on the back of like monks and pastors and people like the people who go to those churches and just are doing the real nitty-gritty work where there's no lights, whatever. I could honor those people till the cows come home. So my purpose in life is so local. I'm so anti-hype and anti-celebrity. And I think the clarity that God brought through that, I was like, Josh, if you're gonna be in that celebrity world, make a mess of it. Like flip some tables. If you go into a place and someone wants you to sign something, be like, I made a joke in seminary. Peter Gentry, it was my Old Testament prof. And he wrote in the back of the ESV study Bible the excerpt on the Septuagint because the dude is a genius. And I jokingly was like, hey, Dr. Gentry, can you sign this? And he just dead-eyed me and was like, God should sign your Bible. It's like, what are you talking? And I was like, whoa. And now I'm like, if someone's like, Josh, you sign my book, I'd be like, nah, man. If you like it, I'm honored. That's God through me. And that's not like oh, pat me on the back. I'm so humble. I'm like, who cares, dude? Does that make sense? So like purpose is cultivated, and for me, my purpose is like I'm so for local people now. Um, I don't want to share any other stories because it's gonna feel like I'm patting myself on the back, but like, ah, yeah, real local people are what matters. Everything on Instagram is a lie. And it took me like life or death to realize how much embodied connection just matters.
That's one of the great mercies of, you know, I can imagine when you are lying on your deathbed and you are, I mean, in your situation, I can imagine the almost dichotomy of like at that point you should have been expecting this joy of new life coming with your son,
Yeah,
and instead you're having to balance this worry of death, which obviously life would come in a different way,
regardless. Yeah,
but in a time where you should have been celebrating the life of your son, you know when you're in that situation, things kind of start to melt away, and
totally.
you see kind of the facade and you see through it. And so, and I think that's a
Yeah,
mercy
dude.
that anybody, I, I always say that suffering is just such a great teacher. It's a great school to go through, and you can tell when someone has been through it.
Yeah,
um and so there's almost like an
yeah.
aroma that people have when they've been through it. um
Mhm.
Almost like a smoke. They've been through the refining fires of it all.
Mm,
And so, yeah, it makes sense. And I guess if anything, we can walk away from it. Purpose may be different for everyone, but
Yeah.
to there is purpose to be found. And I think found may be the word that
Yeah.
we're talking about here.
Yeah. I think you're bang on. Like suffering is like that great equalizer. Doesn't how strong you are, how much money you have in the bank, dude, like whatever. And all you really have is just like, okay, God, it's just me and you. I have everyone else and you guys are praying for me and supporting me. But like you said, like if you make it through, the reason you make it through is grace. And like enough grace touched you that, like you said, you have that smell,
Yeah.
right? Like it's like post gym, except instead of smelling like a hockey pad, you smell like the life to come.
Mm.
And you're like, okay, this is a grace I don't deserve. And if I give off that flavor, like clearly that's not me. El gato.
That's not good. Why would that happen? So you a part of this in we're talking about what it's been doing in your personal life and your personal relationship with the Lord and even your relationship with your family. It's all evolving, it's all being sanctified, but you are in a unique position to where you were able to invite thousands of people. And maybe invite isn't the right word, but it almost felt like a grace for that invitation to be open for people to enter this season with you through prayer and fasting and almost kind of get a glimpse of the refining work and by proxy maybe glean from it. So I'm curious, what did it feel like to have just that overwhelming spiritual support? I mean, could you feel it within your spirit that something was happening?
Yeah. Um, the only way I know how to, yeah, I would feel it every time, dude. I like the only word I have is like unworthy because so many people go through this and they don't have thousands of people praying for them, like voice recordings, prayers. There'd be times I couldn't sleep in the hospital. There's lights, there's people screaming. I just open my phone and there's a voice recording of a prayer and I'm listening and I'm crying. And I'm like, God, like, what? Why me? But we decided pretty early on, and it was a decision. I was like, okay, you know what? Zero pretending, Aislinn, and she would never fake it. They would be me that would want to like wrap it up a bit nicer to like whatever, but we're like zero pretending, zero faking. We're just gonna share our life as it comes. I mean, we don't share everything because like that's would be a bit too much. We don't want to be like a stereotypical like woe is me kind of family either. But we decided early on like, hey, we need your help. Um, we're scared as like so scared. Um, and just the support, and then people were crazy. Like when I say crazy, I mean crazy good. They're like, listen, thank like you just said. Thank you for the opportunity of being able to be there for you. And I'm like, sorry, what? And so many people were like, Josh, like you ministered to me, you saved me from losing my faith. I was so easy to pray for you. Um, or like for me, I just like, yeah, it's like probably the place that I haven't processed the most. Like I don't know if I have the language to say how thankful I am. And I realize that if God has used me in some sense to help someone's spiritual walk, I know like the people who've done that for me, I want to be there for them in whatever way I can. And then to be on the receiving end of it is absolute insanity, right? So like there are times I'm in the hospital and you feel like death with a capital D is like hempen robe and cords and feel the sickle at your neck. And you open up your phone and it's just a prayer. And you're like, and then death and darkness run away. And you're like, Lord, I was so scared. And then I just have this person message me at 2 in the morning when I wake up and open my phone. Like I'm bombarded by grace. And so it feels absolutely unbelievable to have that kind of support. Like, what a dang superpower. And that has been another part of cultivating my purpose out of it, where it's like, okay, everything I do, I want to be able, in some small sense, to be that for other people. And so, if God, if you've given me a platform, the only reason I haven't blown it up is because maybe people will read this at the right time, or maybe I'll start having conversation at the right time, where maybe I am that to someone else. But receiving that dude is like, I had someone message me the other day, her and her husband and kid are going through a tough time. And she was like joking, and she was like, listen, we don't have thousands of people to get to pray for us, but like she's being very kind. She's like, we don't need it. Like, would you just mind praying for us? And I was like, oh, like, whoa. And I had this moment of like, I told her, I was like, listen, I'm not who you think I am. Like, I'm not perfect. I will pray for you. I promise I will pray for you. But like the prayer of 1,000 righteous people or 2,000 or however many people, dude. So here's a crazy thing. I was writing my book, and my editor, when she read the first draft, she's like, Josh, there's like this, what you're writing is amazing. You got a chip on your shoulder still. And I did. And I was still bleeding in the middle of it. So as I started, and then I would hear these stories of people at churches that burnt me and places that like really hurt me who were praying for me. Like, and they would text my family and be like, we've been praying for Josh every day for the past year. And then I'd go visit these churches when I was back in Ontario, and I would have like a horde of people gather around me who just like tears in their eyes. I'm crying, they're crying, like 100 people gathering around me praying for me again or hugging me. And so I was like, oh, I misread what was going on. So I'm in my second draft, it was like, hey, I actually need to reframe this. This was not a you thing. I still had that immaturity of like this was a me thing. And there's some secret saints in these places. I met them. They prayed for me every single day when I had the audacity to blame them for some of my pride and my anger and my rebellion. And so there's an unworthiness and a humility that comes that allowed me to be like, hey, you know what, God? If you're humble enough to meet these people where they're at, and I think they're wrong on so many things still, but if you're humble, if you have the grace and humility to meet people where they're at, like, dang, give me that. And then if you decide to move in people's hearts to give a gift, give me the humility to receive it. So all that to say, it felt friggin' unreal to receive that much kindness and love, that it like softened my heart to a place where like, dude, before I bled, I'd cried like 8 times in my life, including as a kid. I didn't cry as a kid. And now I see like Ransom cuddling up on Aislinn, and I'm like, oh, uh, and yeah, so like, dang, I don't even know.
Now, the other side, I'm curious about this is strictly curiosity because I'm admittedly ignorant. You you have an icon behind you. That is
hmm
a part of your faith and practice.
hmm
So you have, and I have to be careful here how I phrase this because I want to
Say
be
it however you want. Yeah.
accurate. You know, to some, they would say, yeah, you've got all these living saints who are praying for you. Now,
hmm
I think we both understand all saints are alive, and those who are not on this earth are more alive than we are at
Totally.
this moment. But where did your relationship with icons and asking for saints to pray on your behalf, how did that also fit into your healing journey? And I
hmm
guess on top of it, where does it come into play for someone who comes to you and says, hey, I don't have thousands of people that I can call on? Where would you guide them in that? Well, you may not have thousands of people on this earth to call on, but here's where I
Yeah.
looked in my
Yeah.
journey.
You have a great cloud of witnesses.
Exactly.
So for me, like, yeah, it was amazing to have so many people pray for you, but like even that many people aren't omnipresent and omniscient. And so there are terrors in the middle of the night where it's just me and God. And at the beginning of, so I've had saints and icons part of my faith practice for a while. So for me, part of it was like once you start scratching the itch of the early church, you just start to see all these things and you read about certain controversies. So the iconoclasm controversy was a big thing. And I'm pretty convinced by John of Damascus that like icons are a gateway and we look through them to see a greater reality. And so when we could get into the whole veneration versus worship distinction down the road, but for me, the way that I concept, so this is my favorite one. This was given to me as a gift through this time of suffering. This is the Good Shepherd. And every time something would happen, you know those times when you're praying and you're like, God, are you hearing me? So one time I'm at the Ukrainian Catholic Church and I do the Divine Liturgy, and the priest is like, take as long as you want, just like I'll lock the door, just close it on the way out. I got to run to another city and do this because there's not enough of them. So I'm sitting there and I'm doing my prayers, and I get up, and then at the front of the church, on the right hand side, there's this beautiful, I have the icon at a different place in my house of just Jesus, and he's making like the patristic hand symbol of like the Trinity and the blessing and whatever. It's a hand of blessing. And say a prayer, I light my candle, and when I look up, I'm anointed with oil, so I'm smelling this, the spirit is what the visualization or the symbolism is supposed to be. I'm smelling the presence of God, which is a beautiful aroma. So I'm filling my broken lungs with God's spirit. And I look up and you see like these kind eyes looking at you. I'm like, oh, you did hear me. I see you and you're blessing me. And so every time I bled, I would, the chair I'm sitting on, I would put the Good Shepherd on there and I would kneel and I make the sign of the cross to remember where I am and who I am. Also, I'm big on embodiment. I'm an artist and an author. If I don't use my body, I will die. And so I'm kneeling and I'm praying. And every time I look at it, I mean, if I look at it now, I'll probably cry because I'll realize a different thing. So sometimes I'm seeing like Jesus's face or the sheep's face or how Jesus is holding the sheep. And there's sometimes I look and I'm like, yeah, the sheep just like is so broken it can't resist. Right. So it's just like it collapses into the arms. And so um, for me, icons are that window into seeing a greater reality. Now, when it comes to praying with the saints, like you said, the saints are more alive now than ever. And that matters in the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic conception of why we would ask them to pray for us. If we say the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective, listen, like if you're done with the sinful nature in some capacity, yes, there's this quote unquote intermediate state. However, people want to conceptualize that is a different story. Um, but they are in a place where there's like a greater experience of the holy and divine. And so, like, I resonated with all kinds of saints going through this journey. At first, it was Saint Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. I thought I was a lost cause. Like, in the early days, it was like, it's not cancer, it's not tuberculosis, it's not cystic fibrosis, it's not a pulmonary embolism, it's not anything that would ever cause this. And I'd be like, Doc, what do I have? We don't know. I'd be like, listen, you're telling me that with all of our medical advancements in imaging, like, you can't tell me what's gone on. And so I would do the Saint Jude prayer or the prayer of Saint Raphael or pray to like Saint Michael and Saint George, these people who do battle against like dudes, first off, you know how heavy metal some of these archangels are? They like they lead people from the grave into God's presence by fighting off the demons that would try to snatch them away into hell. And you're like, what a kick-ass job. Your job is to lead people into glory. And so like I'm praying these things and I would pray them before. I'd pray these prayers at feasts and at events, like the whole liturgical calendar. But then going through it, praying these prayers out so like Padre Pio, he was a Catholic dude. He's a bit controversial for certain reasons, but he had this healing prayer that I would pray all the time. And I would pray all kinds of prayers, dude. Um, I spent a the one thing I missed about that time, and I still pray as often as I can and cultivate a life of prayer. But dang, when you're suffering, do you just like I'm praying hours a day. Every waking moment is like a prayer. And it was so rich to be like, listen, I've prayed this prayer, and I believe that this saint has heard me, and that this saint is bringing so the aroma of my prayer to the throne, of being like, God, listen, this is Josh's prayer, right? And like, listen, the whole media, there's only one God media. Everybody believes that. This is just like a different way of communicating the story of what this looks like. We have that picture in Revelation. Um, and for me to be like, hey, it would be like when like your pastor prays for you and you feel like, thank God, someone who's got their head on their shoulders and like is a saint is praying for me, but like what, the real saints can pray for me. So there was that aspect of it, but then there was this realization that like everyone who has suffered before has prayed these prayers, Protestant included. Like they've prayed prayers whether or not they realize it. They've prayed the lost cause prayer. Maybe they didn't pray it to a saint, and maybe Jude picked it up and brought it and be like, listen, he doesn't even know how much of a lost cause he is, and that like I can help here. Hey, this is what I can help with. And so for me, it was this like camaraderie that I was like, I'm not alone praying these prayers. God has heard these prayers before and he's answered them before. And then like this is the great cloud of witnesses. These are my people, right? And be like, Lord, can you turn real people away that are praying for me? Can you turn the saints away as they pray for me? Like, so I just had this like they're like halfway through 6 months into this healing journey. I was like, Lord, I am going to not demand or declare, but I'm going to put so much energy into this to do it. I'm gonna pull a Moses. Like, listen, you can't lead me this far and not like you, I can't be 6 months healed and then bleed again because I told everyone. I told my doctors it was when they said miracle, I'm like, yeah, God healed me. I know. And like I told the people at the climbing gym, I told like the 100,000 people online, I tell everyone I meet it was a miracle. I'm like, listen, if I bleed now, this one's on you. And so like for me, it was this whole thing of like, this is a window into heaven. I can look and see the kindness of my Savior's eyes. And I posted this the other day, but Madeline Langle, or however you say her last name, she's French, and she talks about like, listen, this icon is not a direct representation. It's a representation of the feeling you have spiritually when you look to Christ. And all of the icon creators, like this is their spiritual worship. This is their prayer, right? This is their book. This is their podcast. This is their sermon. And so I also prayed the rosary. I also prayed the chot key. Like, dude, I'm like my spiritual, and so like it might be a turnoff for people who are like very into the Reformed or very into the Protestant domain, and that's fine. The only thing I would say is like it's not the boogeyman that like the 90s anti-Catholic, anti-Eastern Orthodox apologists made it out to be. And James White has gotten his bum beaten down a few times by Catholics. Um, where like, listen, like this is a rich Christian tradition. And even if you just want it to be symbolic, there's beauty in just making this a symbol. Um, what's the best? The amount of times growing up, I thought my prayers bounced off the ceiling, and now I'm praying and I'm like, oh, I know that they're hitting your ears because I can see it. Is it's unbelievable. And like once you get over the hiccup of like how awkward it is, the first time I did it, dude, I get it. And the first time I prayed the rosary, I'm like, ugh, I'm not comfortable saying that. Um, but then you realize like, so no Christian denomination is perfect. I'm sorry for ranting, but I have like this cherry pick theology that puts me as an outcast. And one of the things that I'm currently learning is about a bit of like spiritual and theological and ecclesiological humility of where I want to end up. And I have an idea of where it's going to be. There's tons of stuff in that place where I disagree. And I was like, you know what though? Like, I'm not actually interested in the agreements or disagreements in theologically, in the sense that I'm very interested in the fruit that comes out of it. This deep, embodied, spiritual, progressive sanctification. It's really hard to argue against transformation. You know what I mean? So like you take all the like listen, we all hate mega churches, we all hate like Roman abuses and Eastern Orthodox abuses. Everyone hates it. But when you meet a saint, they all kind of tend towards the center. And like, listen, if you're in that center, abuses aside, you're pretty aces. You know what I mean? And so like that is how I get there for me.
You've used the term a couple of times now, and so I feel like we can all guess the answer at this point. But your recovery has been miraculous. That's the only word that I can think of, and
Yeah.
miracle comes to mind. But for some reason, I get the idea that modern, maybe just big box Christianity or just modern Christianity in general is very uncomfortable with the word miracle.
Hmm.
Because you were talking about it earlier, the world that we live in, it's magic. We we have to get comfortable with magic and things being so beyond what we can quantify. And so miracles are just one of those things. And so I guess I want to ask up front, have you experienced a miracle? Are you comfortable saying that?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
What would you say? And you were talking about it earlier about how you were waiting on the doctor to kind of give you the data to back up
Yeah.
why you were healed. What would be kind of your encouragement to someone to maybe embrace miracles in their own lives, and
Hmm.
maybe with that articulate why you would call it a miracle and help someone
Hmm.
along the way?
The big thing for me, so I've been charismatic for a while, and part of it was like, if I'm out of my mind, make it for your sake, God. And I just want to use the language that God uses. Like, how, first off, like, where's your faith? Is your faith in the medical system ultimately? And I'm not saying, like, listen, if something goes on, say a prayer and bleed to death. Like, I still went to the hospital. It's like the medical system is a grace, aspects of it. Um, but so number one, like ultimately my faith is in God. And if I'm not a naturalist, I'm not a materialist, I'm not a scientism guy. I the reason I struggled is I guess by degree I am a scientist. I have an undergrad in physics, so like um but so first off, like, hey, just use the language of God, right? Like I think the reason why big box for sure, and then like maybe modern Christianity tends away from it is because like we're fish swimming in dirty water, and unless you like evolve and walk out of it like a reptile, whatever, like to get Darwinian, and I'm not a Darwinianist, but like to then you just don't realize all the ick of like modernism that has got in you and on you. Like our propensity to like shrug shoulders and, brush off miracles is like embarrassing. One of the regrets I think people will have on that last day is just like how much they poo-pooed supernaturalism because I wanted to fit in with like a couple like raging modern elites. I'd be like, oh, I just want to be accepted in the academy. And be like, forget the academy. I want to be accepted in the annals of heaven. Right? Like, let me just like lean against a building in heaven, smoke a great cigar, and be like, yeah, I was in. Like, I just even if something good happened, I was like, yep, that's God's grace. I'd be like, oh, Josh, but you did that. I'd be like, yeah, but it's God's grace in me. Like, I would way rather err on the side of like all good, God is the source. And of all evil, not God is the source. And so, like, the people who want to, like, say, like, poo-poo miracles would be like, first off, read your New Testaments and your Old Testaments. Number two, like, you do live in a world where, like, if you only have naturalistic explanations of your Christianity, this will probably be the most controversial thing I say. Like, you're not a Christian. Like, Christian is like, I'm not saying you need to be a charismatic. I think you should be. I think you should be a continuationist. And I'm okay with that existing on a spectrum. Speak of the devil. I'm okay with that existing on a spectrum. But the idea that we live in a naturalistic world where, like a deistic world, where God just like wound this whole universe up, um, is crazy. And so, yeah, I'm super comfortable calling it a miracle, and I'm super comfortable he's back. I'm super comfortable calling it and encouraging others to just be super okay with the language of God in his workings. So much so, like, listen, I don't want to get like, when I read the New Testament and you see people having seizures and they have all this demonic oppression, I'm not saying that everyone who has like seizure or whatever has a demon. Obviously, I'm not saying that. But there is this supernatural worldview that the early church had. Like you brought up Augustine, he was not a charismatic, to use an anachronistic term, but he saw so much stuff go down in his congregation that even someone so close to the early church was like, whoa, 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 pump the brakes. Maybe I missed it, actually. Maybe God is still doing New Testament stuff now. And whether or not people think the offices of like apostle, prophet, healer, whatever of exist, that sevenfold ministry or fourfold ministry, whatever like the crazy charismatics say. Um, the world is magic. The world is beyond natural, and the supernatural aspects are the ones that matter most. I'm I'm reviewing, I'm trying to memorize the Nicene Creed. I have the Apostles' Creed, but the Nicene Creed I'm trying to get in my head. And when it talks about God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, all things visible and invisible, I was just praying through it the other day. I'm like, there's way more invisible than there is visible. Love is invisible and it's way more real than you and I are because God is love. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Josh, like our modern world has missed the plot. Oh yeah, unless we see it, touch it, measure it. What does Jesus say? Like to Thomas, like, oh man, blessed are you, Thomas, because you've seen, but blessed are those who believe and don't see. And like, bro, I just want to be that guy. I want to have the faith that's just like, yeah, I take my, in the humility, like I take my miracle, I receive it. The docs couldn't do it. The great physician could. So like, all kudos to the Most High.
We've been able to talk about this miracle experience, this healing journey, a great outcome, if you will. And then
Yeah.
there are going to be those who are either in the thick of it or can point to their situations where, hey, somebody I cared about didn't get that
Yeah.
outcome. So, obviously, in this fallen world that we live in, we
Mhm.
have to still leave room for there are going to be tragedies. There are going to be these things that happen to us. So, what would be your encouragement to somebody who is suffering currently and they don't see that light at the end of the tunnel? They don't think they're going to get through it, or
Mhm.
somebody who has kind of been caught in the crossfire of suffering and they've watched
Mhm.
things unfold. What would be your encouragement to them?
The temptation in that situation is to say, God, if you don't give me what I want, you must not be good. Um, and I know it because I thought it a million times. And then the quick and easy answer is to say, is to be a bit of like a bit of a trudger and be like, fine, I'll just suffer. And if I don't get healed, great. That's great. I'm so happy. Um, and so to the people who are going through it, honestly, my only encouragement, it's twofold. Number one, don't lie about it for a second. God will meet you where you are in the mess. And if part of that is anger, it's anger. Part of that is doubt, it's doubt. He will meet you. I promise. If you are genuine, he will meet you. The second part of it is Christianity offers, and this is like more theological, and I'm taking it from Peter Kraft. He's a Catholic philosopher. He writes this book, Making Sense of Suffering, and he talks about here are like shades of answers. And he's like, the prophets give us some answers, the theologians give us some answers, the artists try to give us answers. And they all reveal something about how do we make sense of suffering? But what we want is why me? Why now? And like, hey, wouldn't it be really good if you healed me, God? Like that would make sense, right? And then his answer is like not a theological, not a prophetic answer. It's like this embodied unity answer of like God made flesh who suffered more than anyone else, who weeps with those who weep, who mourns with those who mourn. So you're not alone. And so when I say like God will meet you, I do mean it. I mean, you have to have eyes to see and ears to hear, and rebellion and resentment get in the way. And so lots of the people who can't hear, bitterness, dude, this is what makes suffering so hard, is you are on the edge of the greatest human experiences ever. Either the deepest forms of bitterness and resentment or the deepest forms of being a receptacle of grace. And when I say that those exist on a knife edge, it's like one day you're like just so mad. And then the other day, whatever. And so for the people who are going through it, I would say, listen, you have a savior. When the scripture says that you have a high priest who can empathize with you, sympathize with your weakness, like the scripture does mean it. Um, and outside of the text, from an experiential perspective, the amount of times where I thought I was at the end and God was just there. And I was like, you know what? If this is the end, I didn't even die alone. Like you were here in the room. So for the people in the middle, I know the fear. You do not need to have an answer yet or ever. You just need to be honest with where you're at. God came to heal the sick, and only those who admit they're sick get healing. And so if fear is what you need to be, you tell God you're afraid. You tell God you doubt him. He knows anyways, but he's big enough to handle it, and he can meet you there, and he will redeem those things. Like I think that there's a quote that someone says, like, no saint, um there's two quotes that I'm converging in my mind, but like saints made out of suffering, but there was never a saint who was a wimp. And so, like, I think you got to get the stuff out. I think God really knows it. And so he's like, listen, if you're like angry, get the anger out. God can take it, and then he can turn that anger into joy for real. And then all of the like strength that went behind the anger is now strength behind the joy. And then that joy is indestructible, but that anger could be indestructible if you don't redeem it. So, like, suffering is the hardest thing you'll ever face because God wants it to get the hell out of you. And I like, you know what I mean? And so like the hell has to get out. And so it's hard because it cuts so deep. So for the people in it, I would just say, listen, you're not alone. You're not the only person who has walked this path. There are saints who are praying for you that you don't even know, alive and dead. And there are people who will be there for you. And greatest of all, you have a savior who is like under every coaster, behind every door, walking beside you. There's a story in The Magician's Nephew where like Diggory, who's the Lewis character, loses his mom in the book and he's bawling his eyes out, just like Lewis as a kid presumably was. And when Lewis is telling the story, Diggory's in the arms of Aslan. Aslan has his great paw wrapped around him. And Diggory's crying in the great lion's mane. And when he looks up, he sees these giant, like lion-shaped wet fur marks where Aslan was crying these lion-shaped tears. And Diggory has this thought of like, you are more sad than me. And when Jesus knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead and he weeps, it's the same thing. He's like, he's more torn up than like, this is what sin has done to my good world. And we don't have answers for why God doesn't heal people, man. Like there's these, I ask the question all the time. Like there's so many great saints who I watch die of cancer at a young age, grow up, and then I'm like, listen, man, there's this little stink of a man, me, who gets healed. And I don't have answers for that. I don't have answer for why one person and not another. There is no answer. I just know for the person who's suffering, all you have to do is be diligent with the time that God has given you. You do what's good. You listen to him. You follow him. You know you're not alone. And if he leads you to the other side, do so with grace and honor, respect, love, joy, like bleed the life to come. Let people smell heaven's scent before you leave. And if you are healed, you have to say, like, to God, like, listen, I'm in your hands. You have me. Use me. Yeah.
Where you're at right now with sword and pencil, you art, writing, all great stuff happening, but you are also fostering community. So I feel like it would be appropriate to kind of end on this note to viewers and listeners who are interested in this lifestyle that you're promoting. Kind of let everybody know what you're up to, where you're at, and maybe some things that are coming up next.
Yeah. So like what Corey said, the big thing for me is community and a lifestyle. Like I am inviting people to become saints. Um, it's literally the path I think every human needs to take. I'm writing a book. I've written a book and it's going through the whole rigmarole. I can't say the name of the book and I can't share the title, but I can share the premise. So the premise, my idea of the book is that becoming a saint is the antidote to disenchantment. And I think disenchantment in our modern times is apathy, anger, mediocrity, bitterness, resentment, whatever. And I think that sainthood, as I've conceived of it for the book, I mean, it's broader than this, but virtue and beauty are the path in our modern times out. And so I want to emulate that on my page. I'm way more, as you know, way more interested in community and people than I am in clout and followers. But embracing the life of a saint it will be the hardest thing any of us ever do. And it will be the only thing worthwhile that any of us do. And for whatever reason, I have this page that keeps growing, which is dumb, because all I do is, like you said, I draw pictures and I write some thoughts. And I just want to use it as best as I can. So if you follow along, if you join the community, I say this often, and this isn't me like being like a person think I'm supposed to be. The magic is the people, right? Like I get to foster a conversation that exists with over 100,000 people. And so some of the ideas are mine, some of the ideas are people I have, like from conversations I get to have with people like you and to others. And I think that there's like this stewardship that I feel where it's like, listen, I don't know what to call this. I don't know if it's ministry. I don't know what this is. What I do know is that together, everything's cliche, like the politics of the world has ruined everything, but like we are in this together. And like I know that's probably like a DNC, like we're all in this together thing, but we all really are. And together as a body, there's a lot of powerful stuff that happens. And yeah, so you can follow me at Sword and Pencil. You can check out my Substack, Everyday Saints, and I have a book coming out in February that I got to do cool art for. There's so much to it. I can't wait to share. But you can read it, and if you don't want to spend the money, I'll see what I can do. I'll record. There'll be an audio version, so like get an Audible subscription and use your credit on it if you want. I get a read for the audiobook, which is cool.
Josh, this has felt like a journey. I feel like we've been able to walk through something together, and I am sure this will be a blessing to those who are able to kind of join us and listen in on this conversation. So thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with me, and hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Yeah, thanks, man. Honestly, thank you for the conversation. You are doing a great thing. Like you said, you do really foster space. People be themselves and get in the deep stuff. Like I got emotional a couple of times. I'm not that guy. So we got in the deep water. So you're doing a good work. Love what you're up to. And I mean, you've also done some great work
Yeah,
for design stuff for me. So I'm super thankful.
yeah, absolutely. All right, well, Josh, till next time.
Yeah, for sure. God bless, man. Thank you very much.
Dude,
Sweet, dude.
that was great.
Woo. Yeah, thank you. Woo.